Somewhere in a drawer that has not been opened in 30 years, history is still waiting to be heard. The disc looks ordinary, a square of black plastic 3.5 inches across, its metal shutter slightly stiff, the handwritten label faded but still legible. Inside it, encoded in patterns of magnetism far too small for human eyes, there may be a lecture, a letter, the working draft of a discovery that was never printed, the machine that can read it. The specific drive, the specific operating system, the specific software may no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Around the world, archives hold millions of floppy disks, magnetic tapes, zip drives, and optical formats that are rapidly becoming unreadable. Every year, the last machines capable of reading certain formats fail and are not replaced. Every year, technicians who spent their careers maintaining vintage hardware retire, taking decades of knowledge with them. And every year, a small and quiet community of specialists races to recover what can still be saved before the window closes entirely and permanently. The magnetic coating that holds the data is slowly shedding. Every read may now be the last read. The 20th century is the most extensively documented era in human history. Offices generated paper in quantities that filled entire warehouses. Scientists published, universities archived, libraries catalogued. And underneath all of this, in a layer that few institutions noticed becoming fragile until it already was, an enormous volume of material existed only in digital form. Encoded on media built to be read by machines that are no longer being made in formats that may no longer have any living documentation. What is at stake is not old software or forgotten entertainment. What is at stake is the correspondence of heads of state, the working papers of prize-winning scientists, the unpublished research of academics who assumed their digital files would outlive their careers, the personal diaries, creative drafts, and professional correspondence of an entire generation, written in formats that have since been abandoned on disks that may since have shed the coating that held the data in place. In libraries, universities and national archives, collections of donated digital media sit in storage, catalogued by label unread. Their contents are unknown. Their condition is undocumented. The volume of unprocessed material runs into the millions of individual items. The number of institutions actively engaged in recovering it is small. The number of specialists who know how to do the work is smaller still. And the media continues to degrade every day while that imbalance persists. Donated box arrives. Inside, among papers and photographs, a bag of floppy disks with handwritten labels. At a major research library, a multi-year project has been quietly working through thousands of floppy disks donated by researchers, writers, and public figures. The project combines traditional archival work, cataloguing, provenance research, access management, with the technical task of reading the disks at all. For each disk, the first question is whether the physical medium has survived well enough to be read. The second is whether the format can be decoded into something a modern researcher can actually open and use. Among the most significant finds were floppy disks belonging to a world-famous theoretical physicist, recovered as part of a larger donation of papers from his office. No one at first knew what to expect. When the recovery team managed to read the first disk, they found lecture notes and working drafts formatted in a word processing system designed for scientific notation. A system that had been discontinued. A system that nothing on a modern computer could natively open or render. In another collection, disks belonging to a senior government official held decades of personal correspondence that historians had never been able to access. Elsewhere, a poet's entire digital archive, working drafts that no one knew existed, emerged from a box of disks donated to a museum, still readable, barely. These discoveries have a quality that archivists describe as quietly astonishing. The material was always there. What was missing was simply the means to reach it. A magnetic tape machine sits motionless in a storage room. No one alive knows its precise encoding format. The problem is not just the physical disk. A floppy stores data in a format determined by the operating system that wrote it. There are hundreds of such formats, and they are not interchangeable. Each requires different software to read, different hardware to interface with, and often documentation that was never properly archived and may no longer exist at all. Many of these formats are understood today by no more than a handful of specialists anywhere in the world. And it is not only floppy disks. Magnetic tape was the primary backup medium for institutions throughout this same era. Tape formats are even more varied and even more dependent on specific hardware. Many archives hold thousands of tape reels, labelled, catalogued, and entirely out of reach. The labels say what is inside. The machines that could open them are museum pieces. The documentation for those machines exists in binders that may themselves have been discarded decades ago. In the Netherlands, a research team recovered data tapes from the country's first web development and hosting company, a firm that created websites throughout the 1990s for institutions and businesses. The tapes held not just the files themselves, but something rarer, the digital DNA of the early internet as it was actually built. Original source code, original layouts, working files of a moment that never expected and never prepared to be studied as history. A zip drive and a stack of zip disks sit on a shelf untouched, quietly becoming unreadable. The early internet is an extraordinarily fragile archive. Websites from the 1990s and early 2000s were built on servers that have long since been decommissioned in formats that browsers can no longer render. Those that were not captured by automated web crawlers, and most were not, simply vanished when the server was switched off. The tapes and disks made as backups during this era represent, in many cases, the only surviving record of what once existed at those addresses. A generation of artists, writers and musicians made their work in digital form for the first time during this period, saving it to media that is now unreadable. Graphic designers whose entire professional archive exists on formats with no surviving reader. Composers whose scores and studio sessions sit on formats no studio still has the hardware to play. An entire layer of cultural production, personal, professional, irreplaceable, is quietly expiring with each passing year. The scale of the problem becomes very real when considered at the level of individual people. The novelist who wrote all her drafts in a proprietary format on hardware she no longer owns. A scientist who kept his working notes in a database that ran only on a discontinued operating system. A filmmaker whose early edited work exists only on proprietary media for a system that has since been discontinued. Each would recognise the label on the disc. None can show anyone else what is inside it. A row of archive boxes stretches out of sight, each one labelled in a different handwriting, a different decade. In workshops and university libraries, in small preservation organisations and individual private collections, a community of archivists and technologists has formed around the problem. They are not a well-funded army, they are mostly small teams, sometimes single individuals, working with budgets that barely cover the cost of the equipment. What they share is a sense of urgency and a technical fluency that spans decades of computing history, from the earliest personal computers through to the last generation of optical disc formats. Materials arrive as part of larger donations: a box of papers, a filing cabinet, a storage unit, and somewhere inside, a bag of floppy disks. The disks are usually undated. They are labelled in ways that make sense only to whoever wrote the label. They have often been stored in conditions that were not ideal. Too warm, too humid, occasionally near magnetic fields that have partially erased what they were meant to protect. The recovery team receives them and begins carefully to assess. Provenance is one of the most important and most difficult problems in this work. A disk labelled in someone's handwriting tells you little about what software created the files on it, what operating system those files were written in, or whether the disk has been written to more than once. Often the only way to determine provenance is to successfully read the disk, which requires first having a working hypothesis about the format. It is a puzzle that requires solving itself. A cardboard box sits on an archival intake desk, the flaps open, rows of floppy disks visible inside. Beyond research institutions, the problem extends to individual estates, to the personal papers of people who kept meticulous digital records and whose families discover after their passing that the records cannot be opened. The files exist. The hardware to access them does not, and the expertise needed to recover the files without destroying them must be sought out, sometimes across countries, at costs that make recovery impractical for families without institutional support, significant resources, or prior knowledge of where to turn. No one has ever fully inventoried the scale of the problem, as no comprehensive survey has ever been undertaken. Libraries and universities know what physical media they hold, but not always what formats those media use, what operating systems created them, or how much of the data is still physically readable. The estimates specialists use are not percentages, they are simply more than anyone has the capacity to recover at the current pace of investment and awareness. A reliable total has never been produced. What makes this problem different from other forms of archival loss is its invisibility. A flooded archive shows visible damage. A burned library leaves visible absence. But a drawer of floppy disks that have passed the point of readability looks identical to a drawer of disks that are fully intact. The damage is below the surface, invisible to any inspection that does not involve actually attempting to read the disk, an attempt that may itself cause additional damage. The moment that archivists find most uncomfortable to describe is the moment they identify a disk that should contain something important, attempt to read it, and find that the coating is shed too far. The file names are sometimes still readable from the directory. The operating system's index of what the disk was supposed to contain. The files themselves, though, are gone, not lost somewhere that careful searching might locate. Gone in the most complete sense of the word. The disk is slid carefully into the imaging device. The head descends. The machine begins to listen. The first step in any recovery session is a physical assessment of the disk. A floppy stores data in a magnetic coating on a thin plastic substrate. Over decades, that coating can delaminate, shed particles, or become brittle. The lubricant protecting the surface from the read head also degrades. Some disks, if simply inserted into a standard drive, will shed coatings so rapidly that the data is destroyed within the first seconds of contact. The physical assessment determines whether it is safe to proceed at all. The primary specialist tool for disk recovery is a controller device that connects a floppy drive to a modern computer and reads the raw magnetic flux transitions on the disk surface, rather than interpreting data according to any assumed format. This approach captures everything, including data in formats that no existing software can currently decode. The raw magnetic image is preserved first, and all decoding work is done afterward on a copy, with no further risk to the original medium. The disk surface shimmers under magnification. Each magnetic variation holds a binary choice, still readable or lost. Reading at the magnetic flux level goes below the level at which file systems operate. A standard drive interprets the magnetic surface and returns data according to the format it expects. A flux level reader does not interpret at all. It records the raw waveform of the disk surface as it passes the read head. This produces a format-agnostic image that can be decoded against any number of format specifications, tried one at a time, until the data resolves. The imaging hardware is only half the problem. The physical drive mechanism must be compatible with the specific disk. An 8-inch disk requires an 8-inch drive. A 5.25-inch disk requires a 5.25-inch drive. These drives are no longer manufactured anywhere in the world. Recovery specialists maintain collections of vintage hardware in various states of repair. And when a drive fails during a session, finding a compatible replacement can take weeks or longer, or sometimes never. One critical constraint during any recovery session is write blocking. The imaging process must never alter the original disk in any way. Never update its directory, never record the time of access, never leave any trace of having been read. Modern operating systems write to storage media automatically when a drive is connected. Specialists use hardware write blockers, small physical devices installed between the drive and the computer, specifically to prevent any unintended write operation. Under ultraviolet light, the damage map becomes visible. Lost areas of coating glow differently from areas that still hold data. Many disks cannot be recovered completely. The magnetic coating has degraded in specific areas. Patches where the data is simply gone. What the recovery team receives in these cases is a partial disk image with unreadable sectors scattered through the data. The work then becomes a form of digital reconstruction, using file system analysis to determine which files are intact and which are fragmented, and attempting to reconstruct missing pieces from adjacent data or from secondary copies that may have been made on other media. Once a clean image has been obtained, the next challenge is format identification. Disk formats are not always documented, some are proprietary. Created by companies that no longer exist, never published in any technical standard, understood today only by communities of enthusiasts who have reverse engineered them over years. The specialist must identify the file system, the sector layout, the encoding method, and the application format of each recovered file. And for each of these, there may be no written guide whatsoever. The retro computing community, hobbyists who maintain and operate vintage computing hardware for personal interest, has become an essential partner in professional digital preservation. Enthusiasts have documented hundreds of obscure disk formats, built open source tools for reading them, and maintain collections of vintage hardware no longer held by any formal institution. Without this informal network of volunteers, many formats would already be permanently out of reach, with no remaining expertise anywhere capable of decoding them. The machine boots. Text fills the screen that no one has read in a very long time. When the data finally resolves, when the format is identified and the files are extracted, the moment is described as quietly affecting. A document opens that was written 30 or 40 years ago on a machine that no longer exists by someone who had no expectation that anyone would ever need to recover it. The content appears exactly as it was left. In some cases, the cursor is still positioned where the author was working on the very last day they saved the file. But recovery is only the first step. Reading data from a disk does not automatically make it usable. A document written in a proprietary word processor from 1988 may open as garbled text, or as a file that nothing modern can pass. The software that created it may have been abandoned or discontinued. Specialists must sometimes install operating system emulators and long-abandoned applications just to render the contents of a recovered file in a form that a researcher can actually read. In one documented case, recovered lecture files from a famous physicist were formatted in a specialized word processing system designed for scientific notation, a system whose developer had long since ceased to exist. Rendering the files required locating an original copy of the discontinued software, finding a machine capable of running it, and extracting the content page by page. Each lecture was complete and intact. The voice it contained had been sealed inside a dying format for more than 20 years, unread by any researcher. Recovered files are printed and compared against a second disk from the same collection. Every line agrees. Different institutions have developed different approaches to this work. Some focus on creating bit-level images of every disk in their collection before attempting to decode any. A triage strategy designed to preserve what can be preserved before further degradation occurs. Others work through collections systematically, from the most physically fragile media to the most stable. A small number of specialists have developed deep expertise in a single format, offering that expertise to institutions around the world on a case-by-case basis. The imaging first strategy has particular appeal for collections of unknown condition, where the format distribution and physical damage are not yet known. By imaging everything first, creating a permanent archival snapshot before any media is handled further. The team ensures that any subsequent damage affects only copies, not originals. The original disks, once imaged, can be placed in controlled storage and not disturbed again. Hard drive archaeology is a newer and even more specialised discipline. When a hard drive fails mechanically, when the read arm crashes against the platter surface or the actuator motor seizes, the data on the platters may still exist, intact but unreachable. Specialists working in controlled environments can disassemble the drive, move the platters into a donor chassis with functioning mechanics, and attempt a partial read before the exposed platters are damaged by the environment or by handling. At the furthest extreme of recovery work lie techniques used when conventional mechanical reading is no longer possible: magnetic force microscopy, a method developed originally for materials science, can scan a disk surface at nanoscale resolution, mapping the magnetic domains that hold the data without any physical contact between probe and surface. This approach is slow and expensive, but it can read disks too damaged for any mechanical drive and can sometimes recover data from platters that have been partially overwritten. Inside a clean room, the drive's cover is removed and the platter is exposed to air for the very first time. The cost of specialist data recovery presents a serious ethical problem for the field. A single hard drive recovery, depending on the complexity of the failure, can cost as much as the annual acquisition budget of a small archive. This creates a hierarchy of what gets saved: material from well-funded institutions, from famous individuals, from commercially valuable collections. The personal papers of an unknown researcher, the creative work of an artist without institutional backing, are far less likely to ever be recovered. There is a recursive dimension to this problem that specialists find quietly troubling. The tools used for disk recovery are themselves subject to the same forces that threaten the disks. Specialist imaging controllers are manufactured in small quantities and their availability is not guaranteed. The software used to decode obscure formats is maintained by volunteers who may at any time lose interest, change careers, or simply run out of time. The expertise lies in a small number of people who are, like everyone, eventually mortal. A corridor of archive shelving stretches into dim distance, every shelf filled with storage boxes. The end is not visible. The scale of the unrecovered archive is impossible to estimate precisely because no comprehensive inventory has ever been undertaken. Institutions know what physical media they hold, but not always what formats those media use, what operating systems created them, or how much of the data is still readable. The figure specialists return to most often is not a percentage. It is simply, more than anyone has the capacity to recover at the current pace of institutional investment and awareness. The rate of loss is accelerating, not slowing. Magnetic media degrades on a curve, slowly at first, then suddenly. A disk that was readable last year may not be readable next year and may not be readable at all by the year after. Specialists trained in the hardware of the 1980s and 1990s are retiring. The market for vintage drives is shrinking. The window for recovering certain formats is now measurable in years, not decades. And for some formats, that window is already closed. The problem does not end with floppy disks. Every storage format is eventually succeeded by another, and every transition produces a new generation of orphan media. Writable compact disks from the early 2000s are now in transition. The die layers of many disks are degrading and drives are becoming scarce. The optical disks burned across the 2000s and 2010s face similar questions. Even solid-state flash storage has failure modes over long time horizons that are poorly understood and rarely planned for. The disk surface shows the bronze ring pattern of optical degradation, a format quietly passing its readable limit. A particular anxiety concerns material created entirely in digital form and never printed, never physically copied. A photograph taken on a phone in 2010 and stored only on a hard drive that has since failed is, in principle, gone. A film shot digitally and stored on a proprietary system that was discontinued is, if the files were never migrated, unrecoverable. The same applies to emails, institutional databases, early social media archives, and entire categories of governmental record that exist now only in formats that are already being deprecated. Professional recovery involves not just technical expertise, but a form of historical reconstruction, an ability to determine from partial evidence, the technical environment in which the data was created, what operating system version was running, what was the default sector size for that format at that time, what known bugs affected the file system on that revision of the software. Each question must be answered correctly in the right order before the data has any chance of resolving into readable files. No shortcut through this process exists. Against this backdrop, the open source and community-based approach to digital preservation represents something quietly remarkable. Tools for reading obscure disk formats, software emulators for obsolete operating systems, databases of format documentation, networks of enthusiasts willing to donate time and hardware. All of this exists outside any institutional budget, maintained by people who feel a genuine responsibility to a heritage they see slipping away. Their work does not make headlines, but for many formats, it is the only reason the data can still be read at all. The material that has been recovered has, where it has reached researchers, already produced historical discoveries that would not otherwise have been possible. Letters that historians did not know existed have clarified timelines and contradicted received accounts. Working drafts have shown how major ideas develop through stages that the finished published work entirely conceals. Scientific notes have revealed abandoned lines of research that might, with new knowledge, be worth revisiting. The past that seems settled turns out in these moments to still be arriving. A monitor fills with streaming text as a vintage drive connects successfully. Each line of output is another file recovered. Archivists who have thought carefully about the long term tend to arrive at the same conclusion, that the recovery window for the most at-risk formats is likely shorter than the time available to address it at the current pace of investment. What would be required is a coordinated, well-resourced international effort, something that has been proposed and discussed many times and never yet fully built. The material exists, the tools exist, the people exist. What has not yet existed is the collective will to treat it as urgent. The contrast with physical media is stark. A letter written on acid-free paper and stored in cool, dry conditions can remain readable for centuries without any special hardware, without any software, without anyone needing to understand the format. A floppy disk stored in the same conditions, holding 1,000 times more information, requires a functioning drive, a compatible operating system, and application software that may not have existed in any maintained form for decades. The digital revolution promised permanence. What it delivered, in many cases, was extreme fragility. There is a philosophical dimension to this that archivists sometimes articulate and sometimes simply feel. The people whose lives and work are stored on these disks recorded their thoughts in a medium that felt modern, reliable and lasting. They could not have anticipated that the format would become unreadable before their deaths, or that their digital files would prove less durable than a handwritten notebook in a drawer. The gap between what was intended and what has occurred is quietly immense. Institutions that have thought carefully about this are increasingly moving toward migration strategies that treat every digital format as temporary. Data is stored in multiple formats simultaneously, current formats for accessibility, open standard formats for long-term viability. It is migrated proactively on a schedule before formats become unsupported rather than after. Hardware and software dependencies are documented in detail and treated as part of the archive itself, rather than as external infrastructure that someone else is responsible for knowing about and maintaining. The drawer is pulled open again. Inside, a disk that has never been imaged, there is still time to try. The specialists who do this work describe themselves as neither nostalgic nor pessimistic. They are pragmatic about what can still be saved and honest about what cannot. They know that some of the material in the collections they work through will not be recovered, that the coating will have shed too far, or the format will prove undocumented, or the hardware will fail before the session is complete. They do the work anyway, because the alternative is to stop, and they find they cannot do that. Every generation creates more digital material than the one before it. Every generation also inherits the format problems of its predecessor. The disks now being painstakingly recovered in libraries and workshops across the world were once the leading edge of how knowledge was stored. They were the future. What will future archivists think of the storage formats of this present moment? The cloud services, the proprietary platforms, the subscription software, and what will be required to recover what has been placed inside them? The drawer is gently closed. What is inside is still there. Whether it can still be read is another question.